happy with your presentation. So I'll give the word to you, Philipp, and thank you for being with us here today.
Thank you. Thanks for inviting me. I hope you see just one photograph now, not 2 or 3.
Now it looks perfect.
Oh, great. Good. Yeah. You know, that's always the tricky start thing. Yeah. Once again, thanks for inviting me. I'm delighted to be able to share some of my thoughts on edible landscapes with you tonight. It's actually only the second time I do this kind of talk. I usually talk about forest gardens, more small scale, local applications of this concept. But now I'm going to give you a broader picture. And I'm very much looking forward to discussing with you and also getting questions at the end after this round about 90 minutes talk. I'm based in a small village called Stjärnsund, about 200 kilometers northwest of Stockholm. It's quite small, 500 people living in this area permanently. In summertime, it's a bit more. And the house I'm sitting in now, we bought this house 15 years ago. And 15 years ago, we started creating a forest garden around the house. I'm not going to be talking too much about that forest garden, but we have now a handful of projects in this area, and I'm also going to present other projects that I've been involved in, and also other ideas and thoughts and projects that I find interesting and I want to share with you. Here's an aerial photograph of the main site that we work on. It's a 2.5 hectare plot that we bought 11 years ago and started transforming from an old kind of beat up, half abandoned field into an edible ecosystem, mostly using forest garden thinking, but also some other agroforestry techniques that we test. And we also have a nursery for edible perennial plants, mostly trees and shrubs. You see that in the upper greenhouse. We also grow totally ordinary annual vegetables. I'll just turn on this laser pointer here. You see, and this is our vegetable garden. We have a greenhouse with annual vegetables and forest garden plants or perennial edible plants. And yeah, it's kind of a research and development site in a way, where we try a lot of different species. We have in total about 300 different species, but many more cultivars. So, for instance, hazelnut would be one species, but we have about 25 different cultivars of hazelnut to test them under these climate conditions. And this is corresponding to the Norwegian climate zone 4 or 5. It's kind of on the edge between 4 and 5. It's quite long winters, short spring, and yeah, short summer as well. Quite cool. Just to make it a bit comparable to wherever you're based, quite dry site as well. We get about 600 millimeters of rain here, and then we have another 4 or 5 projects that we also work on in this area, and also projects in some cities around the country that we work on, which a few of them I'm going to mention later on. Yeah, but now I'm looking forward to starting that journey into the edible landscaping world, and it's going to be a bit of doom and gloom here in the beginning, but I hope you're okay with that. I mean, the things I'm going to be talking about the next few minutes, climate change, biodiversity, and stuff like that, that's things we've known for decades, but somehow I feel it's not just me who starts to realize that this stuff is happening now. It's not just in a distant future. It's actually happening now with all these extreme weather events that we're experiencing all the time, all across the world. And somehow I feel we've now reached the end of the road. We kind of kept going along this pathway of the industrial system that works is based around extraction of resources and putting a lot of carbon dioxide into the atmosphere and transforming natural ecosystems into industrial landscapes of different types that I don't think we can go on with anymore. and we should have changed this a long time ago, but now we're going to be forced to changing this. And just looking at some of the climate scenarios, and this is an old scenario, I couldn't find one for the Nordic area that was more updated on this level of detail. So the actual emissions pathway we're on is probably going to give us an even more extreme scenario. But if we look at the temperature change from the period 1971 to 2000 compared to what's projected for 2071 to 2100, we can see a temperature rise in a large part of Scandinavia where we can grow stuff. We're going to see a temperature rise of 4 to 5 degrees south of Finland, and then even more in the northern parts of our countries, 5 to 6 degrees. So that's a long shot from those 1.5 degrees people are talking about, but that's of course a global figure. So it's going to get a lot warmer, and we can see this here as well. We've been following up on climate change and comparing this to historic data, and here we have already passed 2.5 degrees on average per year. It's the last 20 years, it's been 2.5 degrees warmer on average than during that period, 1971 to 2000, which is quite incredible. Which also will give us a much longer vegetation period. Here we can see the extra days we're going to get thanks to this increase in temperature. We see in the south of Scandinavia, we're going to see 2 months and more longer growing season, which of course opens up totally different possibilities when it comes to crops. And at the same time, we're also going to get a bit more precipitation, mostly rain, actually, not so much snow. But that's, since the temperatures are going to be rising so much, this extra rain we're getting will not compensate for the losses of the evaporation we're going to be seeing. So we're also going to be seeing a lot more drought. And there's a lot of scenarios at least in Sweden, on a very detailed scale, and when you look at those, we can expect a lot more extreme weather events. And this, like, at first glance, this might look a bit positive. Oh, we're going to be able to grow walnuts all the way up to Trondheim and beyond, maybe, and apricots and whatever. But at the same time, climate is getting more extreme in most parts of the planet, and right now, we're extremely dependent on food imports in the Nordic countries, and I'm not sure we're going to be able to import as much as we've been doing the last 60, 70 years in the future. So we're going to have to produce more in a more extreme climate. So that's one thing we have to keep in mind here. We need to produce a lot more food locally in the future, but the climate is going to be more extreme. So it's actually going to be more difficult to grow stuff, especially the stuff that we're growing today that we're used to growing might become much more difficult to grow annual crops, especially out in the fields when we have months of drought and the groundwater resources are already very strained in large parts of Sweden, at least. So we might not be able to irrigate, and so on and so forth. It's a lot of challenges we're going to be seeing just from the changing climate when it comes to temperature and precipitation. But we also see a biodiversity challenge, and you've probably seen this graph or a similar graph from developed by the Stockholm Resilience Center on the global boundaries for different sectors, you can say. Where we have climate change up here, where we've passed we're in the zone of uncertainty. We don't exactly know what's going to happen, although we're quite sure it's going to be quite nasty, especially with the developments we've been seeing the last few years, with no political action being taken into the right direction. But one thing that should worry us just as much as climate change is this MSY thing, which is labeled biosphere integrity, and that's simply the rate of extinction compared to the kind of natural rate of extinction of species, where we're like way out of the zone of uncertainty, like beyond all the boundaries we know. So we actually have a rate of extinction that's somewhere between 100 and 1,000 times higher than the reference. because of climate change and because of our industrial activities, because of the civilization that we have created, which is based around dismantling ecosystems and turning them into products, if you want to simplify it. And that species loss is, on a global scale, can be related to 80% to agriculture, where land is cleared to make more agricultural land, but also in the Nordic countries, in the temperate zones, where we cleared the forest a long time ago, which were growing on the fields that we grow our food on. Even in those countries, a lot of the biodiversity loss and species loss can be attributed to agriculture. And I'll go through a few more facts on this before we come into something more positive here, away from this doom and gloom, these doom and gloom slides. So if you look at agriculture specifically in the north, and this is figures for Sweden, but it's quite similar in the Nordic countries. So you can take them as indicative figures. In Norway, it's probably a bit better because they have more small scale agriculture, but it's probably in a similar scale nonetheless. For instance, there's statistics for Sweden that there are 50% fewer birds, just by numbers, than 1975, so that the bird population has halved, if you just look at the numbers. And we also, despite all the consciousness around environmental impacts and people buying more organic food, and this whole awareness thing that I thought was increasing, and things were kind of looking a bit positive for a while. Despite all that, in Sweden, farmers have increased their pesticide use with 33% since 2014, where I would have expected it to actually go down. And we also see that 55% of all the red listed species are either directly or indirectly connected to agricultural land. But it's not this industrial monocultural pesticide sprayed fertilized land that these species thrive in, but it's kind of this old agricultural landscape, which is more diversified, where no poisons are used, and many of these species that have co-evolved with humans during the course of centuries are now threatened. So this industrialization of agriculture has not been good for biodiversity. It's also in Sweden for 2020 accountable for 15% of greenhouse gas emissions, although agricultural land only accounts for 6% of Sweden's surface. It's 15% of greenhouse gas emissions, and you can find different figures on a global scale, everything from 12 to 25%, depending on which boundaries you draw. And as we also have, which has become more evident now, it's no news. I mean, we've known this forever, but it's at least come up in mainstream media. We're extremely dependent on fossil resources, not just for fuel to power all those tractors, but also to produce the artificial fertilizers and to produce the pesticides. And with this war in Ukraine, this has become very obvious that this is not a very sustainable system for food production, and a lot of countries are facing some sort of starvation within a very short time frame because of this, because they can't finance the input of fossil resources anymore. And then we also have over fertilization. Despite the fact that these fertilizers are fossil based, we use too much of it, and it ends up in the streams and water courses, and eventually in the oceans, creating a lot of problems all the way. And there, when it comes to that, I think it's something like 30% of all the nitrogen and phosphorus that's leaking into the Baltic Sea, for instance, it comes from agriculture, and creates a lot of problems also for biodiversity and so on. And if you kind of try to understand why do we have this system? What's the purpose of having a system that breaks down the environment and creates all these problems, which cost us billions every year to kind of fix, and which erode the carrying capacity of this planet for every season that goes. So we continue using the system. If you want to find one reason for it, it's just the main function, as I see it, for this kind of agriculture, is to provide calories to humans and livestock. Nothing else. That's like the one function these fields have. Of course, it's employment for some people and so on, but the main function is providing humans and animals with calories, and a lot of animals. A lot of the Nordic countries, seed production or wheat and so on production, grain production, goes to feeding animals, which we then eat, or whose milk we drink. So, and like with my background, with my kind of, to begin with, at least, it was a hobby interest in perennial food crops. When I see these systems and read about these statistics, I feel this is not good. We need to turn this around and use way more perennial species in our food production, perennial cropping systems, because then we're going to have higher biodiversity. We don't even have to do anything extra for it. I mean, we can always do more for biodiversity, but just by using perennial crops, we're going to have a higher biodiversity compared to annual crops in an industrial agricultural system. We're also going to see more carbon sequestration. About 1/3 of all the carbon dioxide we have too much of in the atmosphere comes from agricultural land that used to be covered with forest, according to some sources. So getting that carbon back into the soil where we grow our food would be very useful to at least slow down climate change and mitigate it in some way. And perennial plants are much better, of course, at sequestering carbon dioxide, storing it in the soil, because they have permanent root systems. We don't have to disturb the soil as much as we do in annual systems, where we're totally dependent on disturbing the soil, where the carbon content oxidizes and turns into CO2. So also by default, we're going to get much more carbon sequestration when we use annual plants. And of course, we also need less fossil resource input. We don't usually need to fertilize the trees as much, or the perennial crops, because they have these permanent deep root systems. We don't need to drive tractors as much back and forth to keep the soil open, because perennial plants don't require that. And if we design the systems well, we don't need to spray them using pesticides, which are also very high intense on the fossil fuel side, and so on. So there's a lot to win from this perspective. And also, which I forgot to put in here, it's perennial plants are also more resilient to, when it comes to climate change effects, these extreme weather events that we're going to be seeing even more of in the next decades. They're much more resilient to that, because they have better access to water and have these microbes they're working with, teaming up within the root systems, and can buffer these extremes to some extent, at least, if we put the right plants in the right place, of course. And there's a lot of that happening all over the world on agricultural land, but it's still not, by far not enough. But one project which I find very inspiring in this context is Vattholma Agroforestry, just north of Uppsala. It's an organic farm where they grow wheat, different grains, and lots of different legumes, pulses. And between those fields, they have started to plant tree crops. For instance, apple trees in this row. This is Kjell, one of the owners of the place. They planted long rows of apple trees. They have rows of hazelnut bushes. They have rows of sea buckthorn. They have rows of Saskatoon berries. And I think this year they're going to plant a row of some kind of a polyculture with. It's more like a bit more diverse system. But it's mostly berries and fruit they have planted so far. And they still use tractors, of course, to harvest the annual crops between the rows. And he also says that fuel consumption is our biggest impact on the environment, the biggest negative impact. We still have to drive a lot of kilometers every year with our tractors, and they haven't really found a solution to that. They're kind of looking into different technical solutions to that. So the calories in the system still come from what's between the rows, and then the apples kind of help the other crops to grow better because they provide some shelter, and maybe also some of the microbes that are connected to the root system might help the grains and other annual crops. And of course, they provide apples, which can be sold or made into something else. But the calories still come from the annual crops mostly. So this is a wonderful example of this, and they've learned a lot and are experimenting quite a bit. But I think we need to ramp this up even more, because if we want to at least replace some of this industrial agriculture death machine that we're all dependent on, or most of us at least, we're dependent on our survival really for it, because that's where we get the calories from. We need to focus more on perennial crops that contain calories. And now comes the nut focus of this talk. That's really what got me into getting interested in nuts, because there's a few more other crops that are high in carbohydrates that are perennial that we can grow, but nuts in general are the ones that, at least in my opinion, have most potential. So a lot of focus on the rest of this talk is going to be on nut crops, just because that's the function of agriculture. We need to be well fed at the end of the day. We don't want to starve, and for that we need those calories, fat, protein, and carbohydrates. So what I hope that we're going to be seeing more of in the next years, months, maybe even, and definitely decades, is more nut growing out on fields. And this is one other project that I'm involved in, just basically downhill from the forest garden site, our main project, on a neighboring farm, where 3 families who have started this project, quite modest. We don't have much extra time, but we wanted to try something new, and we have started planting hazelnuts, and we used a horse to plow these 1 meter wide stretches to plant hazelnuts in, and we planted them last fall. We started planting hazelnuts just 2 meters between the plants, and we're gonna remove every second plant once they start to get too crowded. And we're going to continue this upwards along the slope. So it's going to be walnuts and probably also chestnuts higher up, where the microclimate is even better. This is the bottom part of this hill, so it's a bit colder. And they've been establishing really well. So we've planted another 20 bushes a few days ago, and we're going to plant another 50 or 60 in the autumn. Most likely, and between the rows, it's kind of a organic mix of grass and clover and stuff like that, which we're gonna keep for the time being, and it's probably gonna get grazed or mowed. Actually, I don't know exactly what's gonna happen next between the rows, but it's some kind of grazing or mowing system that we're going to be using here, and this is for our own consumptions for these 3 families. We expect, no, I forgot the number. Well, potentially it's about 200 kilos of hazelnuts within the next, maybe in 5 years or something like that. So that's quite substantial. It's a lot to eat for us, and it's a lot of experimenting here. We've added some soil from a natural hazelnut population that's just up the hill here on the same property, to see if we can introduce some of the mycorrhiza from there. And we're also going to try some different intercropping systems, where we also use berries and some nitrogen fixing trees and some trees for biodiversity in between the plants. But this is very simple, just hazelnuts and grass and other perennial plants in between the rows. So that's one thing, and maybe in 10 years from now, or 8 years, this might look like this. This is a place I went to half a year ago in Latvia, Oshi. It's an organic hazelnut orchard, which was really good for me to see this in a more mature setting, where they cut the grass between the hazelnut bushes. And unfortunately, they don't get very much harvest from these because they have problems with fungus. It's quite a moist site. But just seeing a 6-hectare hazelnut orchard that was about 10 years old was quite amazing, just to get kind of an image of what it could look like. But still, this is a monoculture. It's a lot of calories one can get from this once these shrubs start producing. But it's a monoculture, and biodiversity is pretty low. What I would like to see more of, much more of, this is systems like this one, Väversunda agroforestry, just south of Omberg, which is a kind of a limestone hill south of Lake Vern. Is it Norwegian? It's it's along Lake Vättern. I always mix up those two. This pointy long lake, it's close to there, the northern tip of that lake, on the slope of this mountain. And this used to be agricultural land where the initiators tried to transform it into a type of multifunctional savanna with a lot of focus on edibility. So in this picture we see hazelnuts. They have lots of hazelnuts planted. We see a large chestnut tree in full flower. This was in mid-July last year. We see different nitrogen fixing trees. There's also cherry trees, and you see a lot of flowers here in the grass layer or ground layer. It's a lot of focus on biodiversity enhancing plants in the ground layer, and many flowering plants were left also in this polyculture, which is centered around nuts. And we can zoom in a little bit here. See another chestnut, a cherry tree, which was actually planted for timber production. So that's why they're kind of pruned along the sides. So you can get good timber production, but it was full of super sweet cherries when I was there. So it's impossible not to eat too many of them. And there were a lot of nuts being produced also on these walnuts. The walnut trees were just full of nuts, and the hazelnuts were full of nuts. It was a good hazelnut year last year. The chestnuts were just flowering, as I mentioned. So I don't know what kind of harvest they were expecting there, but that's a super inspiring system. It was just teeming with life. I was there in an evening just before sunset. I walked around it for a couple of hours, and there were so many birds and insects, and it was so productive from a food perspective. The drawback of this, which most farmers probably will say, this is why I can't do this, is that you need to harvest things manually, and it's kind of a random design also in this place. So it's kind of like small clusters of similar trees and so on, but it's still random. It's about 5 hectares of the savanna type ecosystem, edible ecosystem. So here you need a lot of people who go out in the fall and start collecting those nuts. And that's one thing in our culture, I think, a cultural shift we need. We need to kind of reclaim the fields and get out there and take responsibility for our own food production again. All of us, or most of us, everyone who can. So using well, of course, you can plant nut trees in rows and do it all industrial, but then you haven't really gained very much compared to annual agriculture. So this is kind of my dream vision of what I would like parts of the landscape at least to look like, and then just people can come and pick as much as they need for their own consumption, and maybe they can pay for whatever they harvest on their way out. Have a scale, and you weigh how many nuts you harvested, and so on. So there's many ways of making this into some sort of business as well, I guess. But it's definitely very different from the way we buy food today. We just go to the shop and it's all harvested and shelled and whatever. Yeah, just to wrap up on the agricultural landscape, I could go on about this forever and show many more examples that are inspiring, but I think we can't really expect enormous, tremendous, super fast changes in the agricultural landscape. This project on this picture here was started 20 years ago, or even a bit more than 20 years. And of course, we should have started many more projects of this type 20, 25, 30 years ago, but we haven't. And it takes time for these agroforestry systems to become productive. And I'm not sure we have that much time, and it's really slow political processes, and the farmers are naturally very reluctant to get themselves into these projects because their funding is endangered and so on. Agroforestry is not something that is that it's not really promoted very aggressively by the authorities either. So it's a long way to go. We're going to see much more agroforestry in all the Nordic countries, I'm sure of that, but it's too little and too slow probably. But everyone who works with this on this scale is of course doing a very important job. So I think we also need to, if we want to ensure food security in a changing climate, we also need to look at cities. Of course, it's a no-brainer. So yeah, and I'd like the cities, I hope for the cities not to look like this in the future. This is a very strange urban landscaping project in Örebro, around the university. You're not even supposed to walk in there and step on things. It's really, humans stay out, and they planted these birches in this kind of, it's like a bowl, a concrete bowl, super nice microclimate, and they plant birches in it, which would do fine anywhere. They could have planted chestnuts and mulberries and whatever that's heat demanding in this environment, but it was some type of funny grass and birches. Yeah, and that's it's kind of typical. I mean, this is an extreme example of not very sustainable design, but it's still very common that yeah, that we simply use a lot of exotic species or just clones. It's a lot about looks, about aesthetics in urban settings when it comes to planting perennial stuff, especially trees. So many of them are not native, and they're clones with red leaves or a certain bark structure and so on. So aesthetics have been really driving this in at least in the Western world very much. And it's very low biodiversity in these urban plantings. And now I'm a bit focusing on city centers. I'm going to talk a bit about suburban areas later on, but there's more city center characteristics. So it's quite low biodiversity, and the species we find in these environments are mostly generalist species, which can survive in many different conditions. So these specialist insects and birds and so on, they don't really thrive in these systems, and it's quite easy to attract them, just to tweak things a little bit, to attract many of these insects that are having a really hard time on the red list. And of course, it's barely any food production right now in urban areas, which are mostly concrete. But it doesn't have to be like this. There's a growing number of examples, especially from Sweden, where food is actually food production, kind of a passive food production, is incorporated into these urban landscapes. And one city that inspires me a lot is Malmö, in the very south of Sweden, where they have kind of tucked in these edible, there's a lot of ornamental trees, of course, as well, but they've also tucked in a lot of edible species in this urban environment. And they weren't afraid of doing so. A lot of decision makers in the urban planning departments are really afraid of edible things in the cityscape, because there's going to be rotting fruit on the pavement, or it's going to attract rats. There's all these prejudices against having food producing crops in city environment, and nuts are something that's very well adapted to these urban landscapes, because they don't usually, most of them don't rot, they don't attract these rodents, usually, at least not rats. Of course, mice and squirrels are being attracted by nuts. they're kind of also protected from pollution. So berries and top fruit in city centers is not a very good idea, as long as we have combustion engines at least, and a lot of pollution, because that can enter the fruits easily, while nuts are really well protected from air pollution. So as long as the soil is not polluted too much, there's some mechanisms in these trees that can prevent toxic chemicals from entering the fruit. So as long as the soil is okay, air pollution doesn't enter the nut. So they're quite well adapted to this environment, and they are, of course, heat loving, many of them. So it's perfect to have them like here at a museum, maybe, this building, and they planted 2 or 3 walnut trees right in front of it, and they're full of fruit, and there's never any fruit on the ground. People just pick it, because a lot of people know about these trees. So worrying about nuts on the ground is really not an issue usually in these urban areas. They've also planted a bunch of chestnuts. This is some strange hybrid chestnut that produces chestnuts in really long clusters, which is very unusual for chestnuts. Usually they're in bunches at the tips of the branches, but these are almost like grapevines, and they were well filled. So it's a very interesting individual of chestnuts, and we've collected quite a few seeds from this and tried to test this up here. It's probably too cold, but maybe we're going to ship some of the plants back to the south and see how they perform in the next generation. So it's also a great crop, and it was hard. We just barely managed to get those seeds, because it's so popular to collect chestnuts from this tree, which is right in the center of Malmö, close to the opera. So the demand is there. There's no doubt about that. One tree that is less in demand for some reason is the Turkish tree hazel, or just Turkish hazel, has different names, which you see on this picture. It's a really popular city landscape tree nowadays. This is from Uppsala, 60 kilometers north of Stockholm. But many other cities also have these rows of Turkish hazel trees, and they can be very productive. The ground can be totally littered with nuts, and they're just as edible as ordinary hazelnuts, but they have even thicker shell, so they're even more resistant to air pollution, and they're also more resistant to nut weevils in those areas where nut weevils exist. They can't really drill holes into the shells because it's too thick. Very productive tree, but a lot of people are skeptical and don't know what it is, and so this is still easy to collect lots of nuts from these trees. And in this planting, there's also huskap, or blue honeysuckle, underneath a low-growing kind of ground cover type of that. So this is actually a very simple polyculture of nuts and berries, although I probably wouldn't want to eat those berries so close to the road. Yeah, and as I mentioned before, this urban heat that's created by all the concrete and these stone surfaces and so on create conditions for plants that we might not be able to grow outside the cities for quite some time. So in the cities, we can actually push the boundaries of what's possible to grow even further. And one of them is pawpaw. This is not from Sweden, but there's a few pawpaw plantations in Sweden which are cropping well. It's a strange fruit that, well, it has the kind of the texture of when it's fully ripe, it has a texture of avocado, but tastes anything from vanilla cream to mango, or even pineapple, kind of in that direction. Sometimes a bit dry, sometimes very juicy, depending on the cultivar and the site it's growing on. And also hickories can grow really well in these environments, as long as they get enough moisture, which is the most delicious of all nuts. Not very high yielding, but the taste is just amazing. There's no other nut that tastes like hickory nuts do. We are also able now to grow pecan trees in Sweden. I just before I finished my nut book, I I got news from people in the southwest of Sweden that they actually had harvested pecan nuts from their trees. So that's also a crop we might be seeing more of, especially in urban areas. There's one tree in Stockholm which is supposed to have cropped once as well. And yeah, then kind of where the cities are less dense and there's more space, green spaces and so on around, I also hope to see more of these alleys, which are quite common in many other countries, not so common in the Nordic countries, as far as I've seen at least, alleys with edible trees. Here it's European chestnuts planted together with walnuts, and this is a 3-kilometer long alley in Germany, close to where, I never said this, but I'm originally from Germany and grew up outside Frankfurt, so that's where this picture is taken. Yeah, it's a 3-kilometer long alley of nut trees. And even in Frankfurt, in the city, and in kind of these green areas, there's nut alleys that connect different parts of the city simply, and they're highly productive, and people go there and harvest nuts in the fall. I was recently in Lithuania and Latvia just a week or two ago, and there they have, from the 60s, I think, but also from even further back, they have fruit tree alleys along most of the roads out in the countryside, double rows of apple trees, sometimes pear trees, mostly different fruit trees. Also a very interesting concept. And yeah, and once we get out into the more suburban areas where there's a bit more space to grow stuff, we are seeing more and more, at least in Sweden, where forest gardening has become quite a movement, at least compared to how it was 10 years ago, when most people never even heard about the term. There's now literally thousands of small forest gardens popping up all across the country, and most of them are located in these small neighborhood gardens or in like single household gardens simply. And they could look like this. This is from Gävle on the east coast, north of Stockholm, where the owners had planted an apple tree when they bought the house, and then they got into contact with permaculture and forest gardening, and then they made a polyculture around this apple tree with sea buckthorn and also a hazelnut here in the back, and here's a Saskatoon berry in the middle. I don't know where the text went, and a lot of perennial vegetables and berries as a ground layer. So this is one possible design, and it's so much more productive than those 15-20 square meters of lawn they had before, of course, which they just were cutting and keeping nice and neat, like here. So and when it comes to calories and nice treats, like all these berries, like in this garden, I'd say that all those berries and vines and also many of the top fruits is probably most suitable to have in these home gardens. And then the calorie production would be outside the home gardens, just for spacing reasons. So you have all those treats that you can just go out in the garden and eat some raspberries and wood strawberries and whatever you have in the garden. It's that stuff that's very perishable and doesn't really make sense buying that in the stores. It's much better to eat them directly from the bush, while not store and transport really well, usually, as long as you dry them properly. So those can be produced a bit outside the home gardens around the city or in the agricultural landscape. Yeah, and as I said, forest gardening has really been trending in Sweden, especially in home gardens, but it's also kind of taking the leap outside of the home gardens. And there's quite a few school garden projects, both established ones like this one in Gyttorp, which is north of Örebro, kind of in the center of the southern half of Sweden, which is one of my favorite projects, kind of a lighthouse project, which was established 5 years ago, maybe 4 years ago. It's not very old, but it looks quite mature, with apples, raspberries here, muskmallow, a nice salad crop, than comfrey as a biodiversity enhancing crop and fertility enhancing crop. And it's a really nice environment to be in for the kids as well, who take care of this garden and who also tend the garden as part of the education in the school. And they were also heavily involved in designing this garden. It was a really nice cooperation between the kids, the teachers, and people from the Nature Conservancy Society of Sweden, who took the initiative to this garden. This is a more classic forest garden. They also are planning to plant some nut trees. And this is one of many projects now. The town of Gävle, where this previous garden is located, has decided that all schools eventually are supposed to have their own school gardens, including patches of forest garden, both preschools and schools. And I think that's about 60 or 70 schools. And this year, some of my former students, now colleagues, you can say, are going to be establishing or creating 7 new forest gardens at 7 different schools in Gävle alone. That's just one town, and there's much more like this going on. So it's really a positive development. And we can also see that the forest garden concept, or elements of it at least, are finding their way out into even more public spaces than schoolyards. So this is one park I was involved in, one of 3 to date, also in Örebro, which is one of the cities that has come farthest when it comes to trying new types of parks, which are better for biodiversity and have more edible features, many more edible features. And this one well, it's also a schoolyard partly, but it's also a park. It's during daytime it's a schoolyard, and the rest of the time it's a public park, and it's both. I can't really see this on this picture, but there's really adventurous playing equipment, kind of not the usual things you would expect, but it's the stuff that gives you a bit of an adrenaline kick, you can say. They're kind of behind these trees now, and then all the vegetation that we added was supposed to be edible. So we had walnut trees planted, quite large ones, which the city of Örebro had in a nursery. They were put here, and then we planted quince and peach, and apple trees, plum trees, cherry trees, and a more classic forest garden around here. We had autumn olives under this tree here, and this is the first year after establishment, so it's already looking this nice and lush and green. And this path here is called a snack track. So supposed to, once the fence is removed, which is just kept there during establishment, visitors are supposed to be able to walk along this track and just pick berries and fruit and so on, and help themselves through this. And then this front part with all the nice flowers, that's Peter Kuhn, a Swedish flower genius, I would call him. We now have started a new project with. He's really good at planting biodiversity enhancing species, especially perennial flowers that are really perfectly adapted to a certain species that we want to help. So in this park, he also planted a lot of perennials, both annuals during the first year, but also a lot of perennials, which is supposed to help biodiversity and create this fantastic impression, this visual impression for visitors. So this park, from being just a lawn 2 years ago, where no one wanted to be except people with dogs and the occasional football player, this turned into a place where people come with their kids and they play on the playgrounds and pick berries and so on. It's quite a fantastic environment, and it looks really good so far. We'll see what it's going to look like this summer, when some of the trees are into the 3rd season. So this is also something we're seeing more and more parks being developed with forest gardening thinking and perennial edible crops coming into this. And this was basically unthinkable just a few years ago to do something like this because people were so afraid of planting edibles. I hope it's okay. I just realized here that some questions were popping up. I hope it's okay we take them at the end. It's hard for me to keep track of them. Hope that's all right for you guys who post questions, but then you can all turn on the microphones as well, and we can take them live if you want to. So that's a bit about also just briefly scratching the surface on how cityscapes, urban landscapes, suburban landscapes, what they could look like, and how these perennial crops could enter the scene. But there's one more type of landscape that I haven't mentioned yet, and that's the forest landscape, which covers most of the Nordic countries, actually. And this is unfortunately what it looks like around here most of the time in many places, huge clear cuts and more of them. And in Sweden, again, this is Swedish statistics, and it's probably quite similar in Norway and Finland, is that about 75% of what's being cut every year is turned into short-lived products, like cardboard, these paper coffee cups and other disposable products, packaging, all that kind of stuff. So 75% is things that are going to be disposed and usually burned, and then they release carbon dioxide. So this green bioeconomy that the forest industry always talks about is not really what reality looks like. Short-lived products and these wastelands of clear cuts. And in Sweden, the forestry sector actually is the largest source of greenhouse gas emissions. And it doesn't show in the official statistics because they, for some reason, as the only sector, also can take into account the uptake of carbon dioxide in their tree plantations and forests, which is a bit funny that they're allowed to do that, because the uptake would be much larger if it was all natural forest. Anyway, we don't need to go deeper into this, but it's the single largest source of greenhouse gas emissions in Sweden, because the Swedish forestry industry is using clear cuts almost only. It's like 99% of all. Extraction is based on this technique. And at the same time, it only contributes to GDP with 2%. So it's not really an important sector anymore. It used to be important in Sweden and has built some of the welfare, but nowadays it's become less important than, for instance, the tourist industry, which kind of needs intact ecosystems most of the time. And due to this, I could also rant on this forever and tell you, for instance, that 90% of all forest in Sweden has already been is under influence of this type of forestry, and 60% have been clear cut once, and there's only 5 to 10% natural forest left, which of course this transformation of the natural forest into plantations has had, among many different impacts, had an impact once again on the red list. So of the 10,000 species that are on the red list that are connected to forest, 25 are on the red list, endangered in different ways, in risking extinction sooner or later because of this forestry model. And once again, what's the function? Why are we doing this? 80% of the population of Sweden doesn't want this type of forestry to continue to exist. So why are we doing this? And the main function, again, here is to provide industry with cheap resources, cheap input into the paper mills, especially, which is a very powerful industry, although it doesn't really contribute to be GDP anymore as much as it used to do. And what is this to do with edible landscapes? Well, one of the tree species the most dominant tree species in all these plantations that have replaced the natural forest is Norway spruce, and that's one species we can say goodbye to, at least in the plantations. And that's the plantations are at least 60% of the forested area of Sweden is covered in spruce plantations, or pine plantations for that part. So it's a quite dominant species. This is another scenario which I found very interesting and very odd, that this is not something the forest industry has talked about. On the left, we see the optimal range of Norway spruce from 1961 to 1990, and we see that from most of Sweden and parts of Norway, and all of Finland, and also the Baltic states and parts of Russia, and also down here in the Alps and Carpathians, and some of the central parts of Germany here. These red dots, you can remember those, put them on your mind for a few seconds here. I'll talk about them in a minute. So anyhow, Norway spruce has its ecological optimum over a huge part of Scandinavia, or had from 1961 to 1990. The projected development, and that's once again not an extreme scenario. It's one where we should have done more than we have done for 2050, and that's 20 or 51. That's 29 years from now to 2080. For that period, that the average for that period, according to this projection, we're going to see that spruce will be outside of its optimum ecological range in the most populated part of Sweden, and also in Norway. Large parts along the coast are going to be outside the optimum, while parts that now are not covered by spruce forest might be covered in the north with spruce. Also, a large part of Finland will be without spruce, or spruce will not be in its ecological optimum anymore. And that may not sound very dramatic. Okay, it's no longer optimal, but what happened in Germany here, this little dot here, that's where spruce had its optimum from 61 to 90, and that's what it looks like now, or looked like a couple of years ago. It's just huge dead forests. It's thousands of hectares. I read some figures that about 90% of all the spruce in Germany are dead or dying, especially in the central parts of the country, because the conditions are no longer optimal. Too much drought, too many heat waves in the summer, too extreme weather. Spruce is quite dependent, has a shallow root system dependent on quite stable weather conditions. So this is what we're going to be seeing much more, and we have been seeing this, especially after 2018. This really dry summer. There was a lot of bark beetle, pine bark beetle, or spruce bark beetle, whatever it's called, attacking the forests, and somehow people seem to think that this is going to just pass, and we're going to see it's going to stabilize again. And I don't see how that's happening. People, even the large companies, which should have all the knowledge they need, they still plant spruce in south-facing slopes in this area on the clear cuts. And those spruce may not even, if you look at this picture again, these trees may not even reach an age where it's worth cutting them before they get killed by drought and then insects. So we're going to see an enormous transformation of the forest landscape around us. That's really something we need to expect, especially the plantations, and hopefully not so much in the natural forest, the few natural forests we have remaining, but especially in the plantations, we're going to see a lot of decline of spruce, not so much pine. That's just some areas, according to the same scenario, where pine will not be thriving anymore, but especially spruce. And then the question is, what comes after? And if we look at Germany, what they are doing, they're trying all kinds of different things. Many of them are introducing alien species from North America, which can become invasive because they kind of tolerate these conditions better. And some use natural regeneration where they hope that oak and in some places beech, where it's not too dry, may come back, reestablish, and all these pioneering species and so on. And for Scandinavia, oak is projected to be a species that is going to benefit from this development quite a bit. And we can see this happening here as well, where oak didn't used to be native. We're seeing a lot of small oak seedlings coming up, even in the natural forest. We can see oak all of a sudden, which comes from planted oak trees in private gardens and parks. They start coming up in these, especially on the clear cuts, which seem to be favorable for oak establishment. So the oak is going to return. It used to cover much more of the landscape in the Nordic countries previously, and was because of a cooler climate and also human activities, of course, pushed back south. But now it might come back. And the oak is a, you might not think of this as a food species, but it's, in my eyes, one of the most interesting nut crops, actually, one of the most interesting staple crops for society that bases more of its calorie intake on perennial crop. Not because it's the tastiest one, which it definitely isn't, not because it is very high yielding, which it is, because it's already there. That's like the one thing we don't, at least where oaks are native, and that coincides with a lot of the southern part of Norway, Sweden, and Finland. We already have these really productive oak trees, which yield huge crops every 3rd to 5th year. Basically, just have to go out and harvest those nuts and start processing, start building up a food culture around these trees. And it's the major species for us is the pedunculate oak, or I think it's sometimes called English oak as well, Quercus robur, which can produce something around 1.5 tons of acorns per hectare in a forest setting. So out on a field scale, if you think of this savanna that I was showing before, an oak type savanna, it can be even more, and you can get other benefits of this savanna type ecosystem. Of course, you can have livestock under the trees and so on. So it's a very quite productive tree. You can compare this to wheat. Organic wheat is around 4 tons per hectare, but acorns contain more nutrition and have so many more functions than just being wheat. So it's a very important biodiversity tree. There's no other tree that's as important for insects and birds and so on than the oak is. There's hundreds and even thousands of species are connected to oaks. So it's the one tree that is most important for biodiversity in the Nordic countries. The second most important one is Norway spruce, by the way, which is a bit sad, but that's in a natural forest setting. Yeah, this is what the acorns look like. They have a long stem, kind of. That's how you can identify them. There's another one, Quercus petrea, which has a short stem. Otherwise, they're quite similar. And acorns are, like, if you compare to, I tried to grow oats maybe 10 years ago, and it was so much work getting out those seeds out of the husk and all that, harvesting, preparing the soil, just starting to like sow them and seeing them grow, and yeah, it's a lot of processing for quite a little return. While oaks, you basically just harvest them with a nut wizard, which I should have put a picture in here at this point. It's kind of a net ball which you roll across the ground, and the nuts pop in. You can use it for hazelnuts and chestnuts and acorns and so on. And once you've harvested them, you can crack them easily with a cracker like this, which is a hand cranked cracker. There's different models for this. Is also machine driven crackers available, but this one processes quite a few kilos per hour. No problem to make large quantities. You just put them in on the top, and then you kind of crank this handle back and forth, and then you get shelled acorns, which you then can put in a in a bucket or a bathtub or whatever, depending on the size of the harvest, and all the shells will float up and all the nuts and the rocks will go down, and then you can take out the rocks and just keep the nuts, which then can be processed in different ways. I'm just going to show one way. There's many different types of processing them, but one is to crush them or mix them into a kind of a coarse powder, and then you need to leach out those tannins, which are really bitter, and you can't eat those the native acorns directly from the tree. And if you find one which you can eat, then please contact me. That'd be really cool to find a sweet acorn from the wild in the Nordic area. But most acorns need to be leached of the tannins to make them edible. And one way of doing this is to make this coarse powder, and then putting them into a bag, which you can put into a cold spring, which not everyone has. I happen to have one really close to our house, so I use that one, but you can also use just cold water in the kitchen, which you need to change every now and then. You can also use the water cistern in the toilet and fill it with a bag full of nuts, and put it in the cistern, not in the toilet as such. And then every time you flush, if you have a water toilet, the water's changed, and after a week or so, the nuts are free of tannins, and then you can use them as food. You can dry them, you can dry this powder, or you can process it directly. Also, you can also freeze it. It stores quite well. But the best way to store acorns is to actually store them with the shell on. Then they keep forever, and then you just process them before you want to use them. And we've experimented quite a bit in my family with acorns the last years. Especially 2020 was an amazing nut year. From just one tree in some random town when I was on a road trip, we collected 20 kilos of acorns in 3 or 4 minutes with one of those nut wizards. It's quite easy when these mass years occur, when they produce lots of nuts. It's quite easy to get large amounts of acorns. So we tried acorn burgers, which was very nice and tasty. My 6-year-old son was asking, what type of meat is this? This is really good. And he doesn't eat anything that's not pasta or meat, and barely even meat, but he really liked the acorn burger. So that was a great hit. It was just acorns, some oats, egg, and onions, and some spices. Nice and tasty and very filling. It's quite satisfying. You can't get this from ordinary grains. We also baked bread. This crisp bread in the front is 50% acorn flour and 50% chestnut flour. So it's a tree crop crisp bread. It's also a sourdough made of chestnut flour and just some salt added. It's quite sweet, very tasty, no bitterness at all. And the bread in the back is I think it's 25% acorn and 75% spelt, I think it was. And even that, like, we just stick to the bread, which still consists of 75% annual crops. It was organic, but still, it's from a annual kind of industrial scale agriculture, even though it's organic. But just replacing 25% of that with acorns would make a huge difference when it comes to these environmental issues that we see with annual crops. Like basically every bite we save, which we don't have to take from the industrial agricultural complex, is something good for the environment and probably for our health as well. We also made acorn grits, which is boiled acorns with maple syrup and butter. And you can also add buckwheat if you want to kind of lessen the intensity of the taste. And this kept me going for 6 or 7 hours before I got hungry again. It's so filling. Feels very nutritious to eat acorns. And we also made acorn tofu. When you extract the tannins in the kitchen and you use a glass jar, you also get a bit of starch which is contained in the acorns. That gets washed away when you use the toilet method or this cold spring method. But when you do that in a jar, the leaching, then you get a bit of starch, and the starch can be cooked, and then you get something that resembles tofu. It doesn't really taste very much, but that's actually being eaten in Korea up to today. And you can also make some kind of noodles from the starch, and they eat that with kimchi and different spices, seaweed, and stuff like that. Quite nice. Something to be repeated. Yeah, and as I mentioned, there we already have oaks in the landscape, but we're gonna be able to have many more in parts where the oaks didn't thrive, because we're going to see this really rapid climate change unfolding in the next decades, and we're in the middle of it already, of course. And one way of promoting this native species is by using these boxes in something that might be called guerrilla forestry. And we have all these clear cuts, and I know it's the same in Norway and Finland as well, and also in the Baltic states. There's all these clear cuts, and they try to plant spruce, even though they should know better. And those spruce are going to die. So why not do something better and spread acorns? And you can put up a box like this on a fence, like a friend of mine in Latvia did, or you can build an acorn table, which they use in Germany for reforestation in those former plantations to re-establish oaks. And then the Eurasian jay, which I think is called Nytteplanter in Norwegian, will collect these nuts and then plant them in the perfect spots. And they plant a lot of nuts, and they also eat a lot of nuts, but most of the nuts they actually forget, and they somehow have co-evolved with acorns and also hazelnuts. So we can also spread hazelnuts in the same way, which is a species that works well together with oaks. So we can spread both those species at the same time if we fill those boxes or tables with nuts. And they spread that in the landscape, put them in the perfect place, and many of them are going to germinate probably and fill the landscape that's going to be kind of empty once those plantations start disappearing, with something more useful. So we can create a forest landscape that is more resilient and more multifunctional in the long term. So that's true of the native species, hazelnut and acorns, with the oaks being the dominant, maybe more interesting one, really, from this perspective, because they're so self-sustaining. One species we should look out for is chestnuts, which I've mentioned a few times now. And this is the same type of graph, how well adapted the species is to certain conditions. And these red areas is where it's kind of 100% optimal for chestnuts to grow. So of course, south of France, parts of Italy, north of Spain, Portugal, parts of Britain as well, under today's conditions, west of Germany, and all these gray areas is where you can grow them, but they're not going to naturalize very much. You're not going to see chestnut forests developing, but you can still grow them. And you might also see that it's actually gray in the south of Sweden here, which is only partly true, because also in Stockholm there's chestnut trees which fruit every year. So they actually have a much wider range already today. In this 2070 scenario, RCP 4.5, which is not the most extreme scenario, we can see that chestnut we're gonna be able to grow it without any problems south of the 60th of 60 degrees north, and it's actually going to have its ecological optimum along the west coast of Sweden and also south of Norway. It's quite amazing. From being optimal in north of Spain, it's going to also have its optimum in the southwestern part of Sweden, which I find quite incredible. So that's a species we're gonna see more of, and we might see orchards like this coming up where hybrid chestnuts are planted. They are resistant to chestnut blight, many of the hybrids, selected hybrids, which is something we definitely need to think of. Chestnut blight is the biggest threat to chestnut cultivation. So we need to, in my opinion, use species or cultivars right from the start that are resistant to chestnut blight, which is a fungal disease that killed most chestnuts in North America, drove that species almost into extinction. So this is definitely one view or site I hope we will see more of, people who dare plant chestnuts in these orchard settings, and then you can have grazing animals underneath and pull them out when it's time for harvest. You just shake the trees or wait for the nuts to fall, and then you can use those nut wizards to harvest them. It's super easy, and it's such a great crop. It's comparable to potatoes or corn or maize, whatever you want to call it, and but more nutritious, contains more minerals, and it also has a better carbohydrate composition, so it's more digestible for most people. So it's really one of the most staple crops, and doesn't require much processing. It's easy to store when you dry it. You can make flour of it. You can ferment the flour into sourdough and bake with it, as I showed on one of the previous photos. So it's really one of the top perennial staple crops. Like somebody put it, it's like potatoes falling out of the sky just by themselves. Fantastic. And with time, at least within this new ecological optimum, they might turn into these chestnut forests, which are really beautiful and species rich as well. At least eventually. This is just outside the village where I grew up in Germany. This used to be a chestnut plantation like the one on the previous picture, which was planted in the 1800s, and then it was abandoned for some reason, and the trees started growing. They were pruned really heavily, and they started growing upwards and started seeding in all directions. And now this is 6 hectares in this spot, and there's many more sites where these chestnuts have naturalized and created forests. That's also one of the species which in some places at least may replace those spruce plantations, and they grow big with time, and it's kind of an awe-inspiring environment to be in. Also great firewood and construction wood, very multifunctional species that were even in the older days, just a couple of centuries ago, there were cultures around the Mediterranean who lived on chestnut. Was their #1 staple crop. The chestnut cultures, chestnut civilizations. There's an Italian book on that, quite interesting. These are kind of remote islands where people weren't able to conduct or grow annual crops because the slopes are too steep. So I'm thinking of Norway there, where you don't have as much arable land as Sweden has, for instance, because it's too steep. This could be a wonderful food crop where it thrives. Yeah, and there's so many more nuts. We said this initially, where Ingrid said that I didn't know there were so many nuts to talk about. Like there's about when you include the different oak species which would be suitable to grow in our climate or our future climate, when you include them and all the different walnuts and the different chestnut species and also different hickories and so on, it's about 50 to 60 species that produce nuts that we all can grow in our climates. And I haven't even mentioned half of them, of course, now. So I left out some of the marginal ones because I don't think they're going to play a major role in future food systems. But acorns and chestnuts and hazelnuts and walnuts, I think, will be important. And also maybe beech nuts, at least to some degree. They're native in parts of Scandinavia, not Finland, but Norway and Sweden have natural populations of beech, and that's a food crop that was used quite a lot, especially in Great Britain and Germany, and also further east where there's still some beech growing naturally. And beautiful forest, quite a resilient species, which also is expected to, at least in the bit moisture areas of the Nordic countries, is going to get more space, more of a foothold, spread more, because conditions are going to become more favorable for it. And they produce these small nuts, see them here, in these husks, and the ground can be totally littered with beech nuts in the fall during these mast years at least. And they're quite productive. They produce between 1 and 4 tons per hectare, and that's on average per year. So it's almost as much as wheat in organic agriculture. And these forest and ecosystems are quite important, and they need shading, or they prefer shaded conditions. So they produce this in like real forest conditions with all the benefits a real forest brings. And the nuts contain about 50% fat, so it's an oil crop really, 19% protein and 20% carbohydrates. It's really nutrient dense. The drawback with them is that they're very small most of the time, so that's one option for selecting better species or better cultivars and so on for nut size. The nuts are small and they're quite fiddly to shell. As far as I know, there's no machine for shelling them, or no device for shelling them. So you have to kind of use a knife, or you can put them in the oven and they're gonna kind of pop and are easier to shell, which is quite a hassle. It's also a bit difficult to harvest them. You can't use the nut wizards; they're too small for that. So you have to kind of shovel all the leaves and everything into some kind of container, and then shake out the nuts, preferably in the forest. You leave all the leaves and husks in the forest. You don't export them from the forest. So some of the nutrients are retained. So it's a bit fiddly to harvest, which is also the reason why this really was an oil crop. Historically, people would just take the nuts with the shell, which is really thin, and put them in an oil press. And then you get a really high quality oil. Half of the weight is oil. You get that, and then the rest, what was left after oil extraction, was given to animals, to pigs or poultry, rich in protein and carbohydrates. There's also there's a chemical substance in the nuts which is kind of toxic to humans. So they also need to be cooked or roasted, and it breaks down quite quickly from heat. So you have to roast them. So I don't think, because it's quite fiddly, I don't think this is going to be a major food crop. Maybe as we're going to see more pigs in the forest again, that animal husbandry in the forest with semi-wild pigs or whatever, which eat these, maybe is more realistic, like in the old days. But it's definitely something we might turn back to when we have to, when we can't import oil from other countries anymore, which I'm pretty convinced we're going to see happening quite soon. Actually, just before I started talking here today, I saw that I think it was Indonesia has stopped exporting palm oil because they need it domestically. So it's one big source of cooking oil or food oil, which has disappeared here. So we really have to find those oil crops for the Nordic area as well. Which brings me to the hickories, also more of a marginal crop. I mentioned, I think it was shellbark hickory I had on a previous slide. Before the Ice Age, and also in North America now, there's forest type existing existed before the Ice Age in Europe as well, which was the hickory oak forest. So the hickories used to be native in the Nordic area before the Ice Age, which was of course a long time ago. And in the most fertile areas where there's a lot of water moving in the ground, that's where the hickories are kind of sometimes a bit dominant, or there's more of them. And then in the drier, less fertile areas, there's oaks producing acorns. And the three species of hickories that I think are most interesting for us to grow is, for one, bitternut hickory, which has inedible nuts. So why grow them? it's because the fat is edible, but not the nut as such. It's very bitter, but it has a very thin. The nut has a very thin shell, and it's super rich in oil. It can be up to 70% oil in these, or fat in these nuts. And you can also extract the oil without shelling them. So you can just put them in a bit more heavy-duty oil press, and you get out this sweet, fantastic cooking oil with a very good fatty acid composition. And it's also super hardy. There's actually one fertile tree not far away from here in this cold part of Sweden, zone 4 or 5, climate zone 4 or 5. Even in the Norwegian system, there's one fertile tree that gives nuts in this area. So it's quite amazing. And they can be very productive if they're in the right site. So need moisture and fertile soil. They're really productive. And then the 2 other hickories, which are more for edible purposes, are shagbark hickory and shellbark hickory. Both are kind of about the same hardiness. Shellbark hickory is a bit less hardy, according to most sources, and they crop in even in Finland, actually, in several places they have cropped, and in Sweden it's as far as I know, it's Stockholm is the most location for cropping or fertile hickory trees. And that's, as I mentioned before, it's the best tasting nuts of all of them. Both of them are super nice tasting. It's so rich and delicious. So that's not a staple crop, which we're going to get tons of, but it's really this extra nutrient dense crop, high in fats, which is going to make life better once we can harvest them. And grafted trees of all of these three can yield a crop after 3 to 4 years after planting or after grafting. There's a grower in Lithuania who's tested many different cultivars who is getting crops now just after a few years. One question you might be asking, and I see there's a lot of stuff going on in the chat, we'll soon get to that, I'm almost through here, is how many trees do we need for this to become some kind of a reality? I just made this calculation just for my own sake, just to try to understand how realistic would it be to have a more nut-based diet in the Nordic area. And if we look at the calorie intake, and that's fat, carbohydrates, and protein, and also I also looked at the right kind of distribution between fat, carbohydrates, and protein. I don't recall this right now what the right distribution was, but that's taken into account here. Then to get about 50% of that from nuts, we would need 1 oak, each and every one of us, producing about 33 to 65 kilograms of acorns per year. We would need 1 chestnut, producing 50 kilos of nuts per year. And that's a pruned chestnut, which is grown like an apple tree, not like a forest chestnut. They don't produce that much, or they take up much more space, rather. And about 2 hazelnut bushes, and they give something between 3 to 9 kilos per bush and year, on average. Not every year usually, but every second year or something like that. But on average is 3 to 9 kilos per plant. Also to extract oil, to eat the nuts. They're really multifunctional, again, both food-wise and other products they produce, these hazelnuts. I haven't talked too much about hazelnuts today, but it's a very nice crop. Also one that can yield very fast. Just in 2-3 years, you can get a nice hazelnut crop if you establish the plants properly. And then just 1/2 walnut tree, because they're so rich in fat, and they can give 20 to 60 kilos nuts per year, mature walnut trees. So it's not really that many trees, and you can of course switch compositions. If you don't like acorns, you can plant more chestnuts or add hickories or whatever other nut trees you're interested in. It's just to give you an example of what it could look like. And that's just, if you look at the crown area of mature trees or prune trees, as for the chestnut, you only need 500 square meters of nut trees per person. And they can also be integrated with other species or other types of land use. So it's not like these 500 square meters are wasted. It's not very much, and you can calculate how much this would mean tree-wise and area-wise for your village, for your town, for your country, whatever calculation you want to do. Found this quite interesting to make this little exercise, and planting all these trees would correspond to what's being planted in 2 years' time in Sweden in the forestry sector. So all these clear cuts that are replanted with spruce, in 2 years they plant so many trees that if all those trees had been nut trees, we could, once they have grown up, we could cover half of the population's calorie intake in theory. Of course, it's very hypothetical, but just to give you an kind of a scale. So there is an industry that can produce a lot of trees already in place. So to summarize here, this is, by the way, walnuts, also a picture taken from my new book on growing nuts, which is coming in 2 or 3 weeks from now, I hope. Different types of preparing walnuts, super delicious, not just as a snack, but also in like real food with rice or miso, or here's a paneer with this Indian cheese, and it's in a walnut cream. Super tasty, all of this. But anyways, I was supposed to summarize here. With using perennial crops with a focus on nut trees because they're so calorie rich, we can take a big step to climate change adaptation. I don't think we can stop this from happening anymore. It's like too far, and things are happening too slow. So we need to adapt, and that in my eyes needs transformation from these annual crops to perennial crops, which are more resilient in a changing climate. And I think we're going to have to start. I mean, we have to work on agricultural land as well, and try to convince farmers to make this transition. But if you're already really pressed when it comes to prices and all that, they don't have margins for experiments or new stuff, or to wait for 6-10 years to get a crop. So we can't really expect a lot to happen in the agricultural land, but in cities and suburbia especially, but also on marginal land. When I was in Latvia last year, I met a farmer who got some funding for planting walnut trees on all the lands he can plow. And we also have all these green spaces in urban environments where we could plant nut trees and fruit trees and so on, which are not being used today. So there's a lot of space, and we need to do this now as fast as possible. Yeah, and as I talked about before, we need to reclaim the woods. I don't see why this destructive industry should lay hands on a huge proportion of our countries and dominate them entirely for products that no one needs, with huge negative environmental consequences. So we need to reclaim the woods, and the least we can do is spread some seeds with the help of birds. And when it comes to crops, I think nuts number one because of the calories and oil and protein, so forth, and pomes like apples and pears, also very useful crops that can be stored, and then maybe stone fruit, plums and apricots and peaches and stuff like that, and then all the berries and perennial vegetables and all that, we can put that in the home gardens and kind of close to where people live. But out in the landscape, we can plant these larger trees. And last but not least, I think it's going to have to be a combination of push and pull, like pushing people to grow stuff by helping them, like from political perspective, helping them plant trees, edible tree crops in all kinds of places, but also pull to like with this food in the background, get chefs to try these nut crops and the other perennial crops, incorporate them into their menus, like many chefs do already, which creates some kind of, at least for the people who go to those more fancy restaurants, maybe they start to understand or get used to these crops, which we're not used to. We don't have a culture anymore around nuts. We had this, at least where hazelnuts grew, we had a nut culture about 150 years ago, which has disappeared. And I think we need to build up a new nut culture. And we can both push it in different ways, and we can also create a pull, so more farmers maybe, hopefully, will find it worthwhile to plant this, and we can also influence urban planners and convince them of planting nut trees and other edible crops in urban landscapes. So it's a combination there. On that note, I would like to say thank you. Now there's also time for questions, as we mentioned before. If you're interested in any of the books I've made, it's there's one, they're on Swedish. Unfortunately, there's one on, but at least, yeah, I think most Norwegians understand Swedish quite well. One on perennial vegetables, one on forest gardening, quite thick book, and my new book on growing nuts, the Nut Grower's Handbook, which is almost on its way from the printery now to our warehouse. All right.
That's great, Philip. Thank you so much. That was really inspiring. You've done such a great job. I'm thinking about buying more land. All right, let's see. The first question is if you could talk a little bit about tools for harvesting the different type of nuts. So probably both to reach maybe, or and how you go about harvesting.
Yeah. Many of the nuts fall to the ground, like chestnuts, walnuts, acorns. You don't really have to do much. They come naturally on the ground, and you have to be quick. But the more nut trees we have, the less pressure there's going to be from animals. I've also seen that in more nut tree dense areas of Europe. The more nut trees, the less disappears percentage wise. Hazelnuts, which a lot of people grow already, I think you need to pick them from the shrubs, at least if you have birds that like hazelnuts. Otherwise they're going to disappear, and they're really good at finding the best ones and pick them from the shrub and take them away. So the way that works for us up here, where we have this European jay that is very likes hazelnuts very much, we harvest them preferably a day or two before the birds can take them, because they're really strongly attached to the husk and the bush, and they can't rip them off. They try. I've seen them like fly into the bush and try to like check all the different clusters with nuts. And once they see that they're kind of becoming loose, they start harvesting them, and then they can take all the nuts on a bush within an hour or two. So we have to get it before that, because we can take the nuts and dry them indoors, and they can ripen indoors. So I push the nuts sideways in their husks, and when they pop out without too much of an effort, then they're basically ripe. You can harvest them and dry them indoors, and they're going to ripen nicely. If they don't loosen from the husk, then they're not ripe, and you have to wait for another day or another week, depending on the conditions. So that's you could use one of those nut wizards, these round net balls, but then that's usually when you have a monoculture where there's no birds and squirrels and stuff to harvest hazelnuts. Yeah, and then the different cones, like pine cones, I didn't mention that too much because they're probably gonna have a hard time growing in the Nordic area. Apart from Korean pine nuts, you can also pick them from the tree. Then they have to climb, or you wait for the birds to chuck them down on the ground. And you have to be there and pick them up, otherwise they're going to disappear. But it's really simple harvesting tools. And I talked to a commercial organic walnut grower in Germany last year, and he said he uses only these hand tools, these nut wizards. You can Google. Should have taken a picture into the presentation, but you can Google nut wizard and you're going to find a photo of what they look like. And he uses that for his whole plantation, and I think he has 15 hectares. And he says he can harvest 2 hectares per day with a nut wizard, and none of the machines that are available are worth purchasing. And if you have steep terrain or many rocks on the ground, then you can use nets, which you put up underneath the trees, and you just wait for the nuts to fall on the nets, and then you harvest it like olives, basically. Same technique.
Perfect. And I have a question. I'm not sure I understand it, but you might. So I'm just going to read it. Tell about why, yes or no, low grains on a walnut tree. Sorry. Can other nut trees be planted around a walnut, not like fruit trees? Annette, if it wasn't clear to you, then Annette, you need to rephrase your questions again, and we'll answer it in the end.
I think he understands.
If we can have low branches on walnut trees, if that's good or bad.
Yeah, some people say that you have to cut them away. I have one low branch. Should I take it away? Because the rest of the tree starts at almost 2 meters high.
Yeah, then I think you can take it away. It's probably because of fungal diseases that the fungal spores can spray up from the ground on the leaves, and then the tree can get infected. Maybe that's one of the reasons, but I wouldn't worry too much about it. But definitely you can take them away, and I would cut them in mid-June to mid-July. If you cut them now, they're gonna lose a lot of sap. They start bleeding. And they can also heal. They have the best healing capacity in mid-June to July. And you can plant a lot of stuff around walnut trees. There's a myth about walnut trees killing their neighbors, which comes from North America, from the black walnut, which can kill some trees, especially pine trees, white pine trees. But walnuts are a bit thirsty. Not so much the European or English or Persian walnut or whatever you want to call it, but the other walnuts are quite thirsty. So they take a lot of water. They have quite aggressive root systems, which means it's hard to grow stuff underneath them. But the English walnut, Jugelandsrega, it's the least complicated one of them, and you can actually grow them with apples. In my village in Germany, it's apples and walnuts together, and it's no problem. You just have to watch out for shading.
Yeah.
So the apple trees get enough light, so shade and water are the issues with walnuts. Not juglone, this poison. It's poisonous, but it's not very aggressive. It's overrated, I would say.
Thank you so much for clarifying, Annette. That was helpful to me. And there's a question: is there any nut crop which will thrive or survive in the northernmost parts of Scandinavia?
Yeah, that would be the pine nuts or nut pines. It's the dwarf pine, Pinus pumila, which has small cones and contains seeds that are very similar to pine. The pine nuts you buy in the shop, they're just a bit smaller. And then you have the Siberian pine tree, which is super hardy also. It grows almost up to the tree line, which produces larger cones and larger seeds. It's one of my favorites taste-wise. It's really nutrient dense and also a beautiful tree. Good for wildlife. Has many uses.
Great.
But that's it. It's those two. Sorry.
Yes, no, that's great. I didn't even know there was pine trees with larger nuts, so that was great. I have a lot of hazel growing in my garden. What do I do to make them produce nuts that actually have nuts inside?
Yeah, it's all about harvesting at the right time, because the birds don't take the empty ones. Of course, they know they can kind of feel the weight of the nut, I think. Or whichever way they do that. So they only leave the empty nuts, and hazelnuts also drop empty or damaged nuts, many of them about a week or two before the rest of the nuts are ripe. So if you find a lot of empty nuts on the ground and then only empty nuts on the bush, then the birds have taken all the good ones, and then you think, oh no, my hazelnuts are not producing. So you can check the bush in, say, early August. You can start checking and just take a few nuts and see if they're failed. And once they pop out, as I mentioned before, they are basically ripe, and you have to take them indoors and dry them in a place where there's no mice or so who can take them. So you just have to be there before the birds and the squirrels. Then there are fungal diseases. There's also this nut weevil, I don't know how far up in Norway that exists. They can make holes into the nuts, but they don't usually take the whole crop. So there should always be, if there's hazelnuts, like developed nuts on the bush, there should also be nuts that are filled with a kernel. You just have to be there in the right time and watch the shrub the whole season.
Great. And from hazel to oak tree, is there some special kind of fertilizer for my tree?
Usually oaks don't need any fertilization. I don't think, unless it grows really badly, then usually you can just add some compost if there's something wrong with it in that way. Depends a bit on where you are. It might also be too cold actually in our countries. But usually they don't need any special treatment when it comes to fertilizer. And the next question I see that is, it's about horse chestnut, and they're not edible, they're poisonous. You can use them to wash your clothes, but you can't eat them.
And do you know any cultures or societies which largely have relied on nut crops?
Yeah, there's quite a few examples of this. We can stick to the pine nuts that I mentioned before here. In the Siberian taiga, there's several indigenous peoples that live very much on these pine nuts. They are very careful with them, and the trees are holy, and much of the diet is centered around these Siberian pine tree nuts, which they harvest from August to October or something like that. And those forests are dominated by those pine trees, so it's easy to get a lot of nuts. And then we have these chestnut cultures in Italy and parts of Spain, parts of France, these mountainous areas. People were living off chestnuts, and in North America, hickories were really important for some people in the kind of central part of the eastern United States. Pecan as well was very important as a major food crop, also a holy tree, just to name a few examples of species we can grow up here as well.
And there's a question about chestnut blight. Does it exist in Europe or Scandinavia? The questioner, he has bought a tree in Geneva today and going by van home to Norway. Could this cause a problem?
Yeah, that can cause a problem, especially when you go to customs, because it's strictly forbidden to import chestnuts, at least to Sweden. I'm not actually sure, because Norway is not in the European Union what the rules are, but it's usually quite strict. And there is chestnut blight in all of continental Europe, and it's not in Sweden, at least not reported. So Sweden is a special quarantine zone. We're not allowed to even purchase seeds from other countries unless they're certified free from chestnut blight. So you might check with the Norwegian authorities there. But then again, a lot of people have been taking in chestnuts and chestnut trees from Europe, and so I think we already have chestnut blight in Scandinavia. It just hasn't been reported yet. I would expect somebody had it with them from some tree someplace.
And there's a question about almond. How does the development looks for them? Like castagne, what's that in English?
Chestnut, yeah.
Chestnut.
Yeah, almond. It's a bit tricky to grow almonds. There are people actually in Norway, somewhere in the south, who produce almonds on a yearly basis. They have quite a few trees. I read an article about this when I was researching for the book, and there's also a lot of people in Sweden who grow almonds. They're quite sensitive for high moisture levels and cool weather in like July or something. They easily get fungal diseases. So it's a bit more difficult crop to grow in general. But then there's a hybrid. It's the peach almond. It's a cross between peach and almond with sweet seeds. That one is a bit more robust, and we have one of those in one of our greenhouses. It's an unheated greenhouse. It's flowering now for the first time, so we'll see. But that grows well in Stockholm and even someone north of Stockholm who gets almonds almost every year. So it's but like on a more like large scale setting orchard kind of thing, I think they're too prone to disease to work well. So I wouldn't plant too many of them. 1 or 2. Nice addition to the diet.
Philip, I have 2 almond trees from last year. Then someone did it better than me, so I got her plants while I had published how to do it. So my almond trees are now almost 1 meter inside, one year old. Do you suggest I would plant them in a cold greenhouse?
What kind of climate?
I can.
If you're in zone 1, climate zone 1, then you can have them outdoors.
I'm inside zone 2B in Norway.
2B, yeah, it's a bit borderline, but you can try. Yeah, but if you let them grow for 1 more season in a greenhouse, they're going to be more cold hardy. The bark is going to get thicker, and they're going to withstand more cold. You can try in a good location, a southwest facing slope, and dry as possible.
Near a rocky wall, or
a wall or rocks or something like that. Yeah, that's a good spot for them.
Yeah, thanks.
Good luck.
Yeah, thanks.
Is all beech trees giving nuts?
Yeah, in theory, but it's a lot of variation between individuals. They also need to be cross-pollinated, but in theory, they all can give nuts. Yeah.
Let's see. There's a long one here, and I'm just trying to figure out if it's the question. It's about customs, or please, let's say, if guerrilla seeding Norwegian forest, please use local seeds or cooperate with the forest owner. Otherwise, the forest owner gets major legal problems. Okay, so there is a link in the chat if you want to
thanks.
learn about foreign.
That's a very good point. I forgot to mention that it's not the same legal issue in Sweden, but nonetheless, no matter what you do, you should use local seeds, not spread invasive species out in the forest or foreign species. It should be from local seed sources, definitely. Thanks.
And there is Stephen Barthow. He has some, he says Pinus sembra, Pinus sibirica, or Pinus pumila. These are the nut trees worth trying in the north. He should know. Pinus sembra is invasive in Trondheim.
Oh, really? Interesting. Yeah, in some places they just spread. I've never seen any seedling plants around here. There's quite a few trees in private gardens, and some people tell me they just spread like crazy.
Might be a problem in the future.
Yeah.
And it's not allowed to import chestnuts to Norway, Stephen also says.
Yeah, I should just add about the Sembra furu in Trondheim, that it's gone invasive is because the Siberian nutcracker has formed a local kind of colony, originally breeding in Siberia, but because Pinus sembra was planted very much in the 1970s around Trondheim, the birds, they invade Scandinavia every few years when their food supply is running out in Siberia. And 1 year, almost 20 years ago now, the birds arrived in Trondheim and discovered that their food supply was also here, and a few of the birds stayed. So we have a subpopulation of the Siberian nutcracker, or Nytteplanter, around Trondheim. And then they cache the seeds in the forest, which they find in the winter, and a few of those seeds then will germinate, and therefore they're spreading their own food supply.
Yeah.
The last question is in Swedish. Pimpenöt.
Pimpenöt, yeah.
What is that? How is it going? Your favorite pimpenöts?
Yeah. That was haven't even mentioned it's not very high yielding actually, so I excluded it from this talk. It's a shrub which is native to Central Europe, or one of the bladder nuts is native to Central Europe. It produces pods which are filled with something that resembles pig cheese. Chickpeas. Getting tired at the end. Resembles chickpeas. And when they're ripe, they get a really hard shell, and you have to dry them for a bit, and then they kind of shrink, and then you can crack them easily with different nut cracking devices. And then you get a seed that's quite sweet and very oily, and some people say it tastes a bit like pistachio. You can also eat the flowers and the shoots. It's quite a nice crop. And my bladder nuts grow well, but they didn't give any fruit. They flowered nicely last year, but they didn't give any nuts for some reason. I still have to figure out why that was the case. But it's really more a nibble than a staple crop, a nice addition to the diet, rather than a big important calorie input. But it's a beautiful shrub, very ornamental and not invasive, I would say. I've never seen them grow from seed anywhere, not even in the southern part of Europe.
Perfect. That's great. Thank you so much for staying 20 more minutes to answer all our questions. And based on your knowledge and experience with this topic, we might invite you in the future on similar talks. And I hope to see you again. So I can also give information about the recording from this meeting will be available on KVANN.no, the webpage of Norwegian Seed Savers, in a couple of days. And if you are a member in KVANN, you can also watch it there. So thank you so much for joining us today, Philipp. And if you want to buy your book, I also shared the link in the chat to your blog.
Thanks so much. Thanks for inviting me, and thanks everyone for showing up.
Yeah, I'd just like to add a thank you as well. Thanks very much. That was really interesting. And not only a webinar, perhaps you'd consider doing a tour of Norway sometime, live.
Yeah, I'd love to. COVID has been keeping me in Sweden.
Get in touch when you're feeling up to that, you know.
Yeah.
And we'll see if we can help.
Yep. Yeah, watch out for me.
Yeah.
Okay, perfect, everybody. And then we'll say goodbye for now, and hopefully we'll see you again soon. Bye.
Bye.
Bye. Cheers.